Okay, welcome everyone officially for joining us for the Summit Engineering Industrial Stormwater webinar. We're very glad to have you all here joining us for this lunch hour. Quick intro about who we are and what we do here. Summit Engineering is a multidiscipline engineering firm that services Northern California and beyond. We have civil, structural, electrical, water, wastewater, and planning services at our firm. And a little fun fact about us, if you didn't already know, we actually were founded in 1978 as a civil engineering firm. So we have plenty of experience with these civil engineering and water-related tasks. You're in great hands today. Your speakers are Jesus Hernandez and Jasper Gehring, who are members of our civil engineering division. A couple of quick ground rules before we get started. You'll notice that everyone's on mute. This will just help keep things streamlined, avoid disruptions. However, please feel free at any time to submit questions that you may have throughout the presentation. There is a Q&A box in the bar below. Feel free to send your questions there or to Jesus Hernandez directly. If you're not quite as familiar with Zoom functions, do feel free to send an email directly to Jesus. His email address is there. It's jesus@summit-sr.com. And then another quick note, this presentation is currently being recorded, and we will share the recording as well as the slides for you all if there's more information that you want to check back up on. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Jesus.
Thank you, Kat. So what are we going to be talking about today? We will be covering what the industrial general permit is, how that applies to wineries, the different SWIP components and a process to develop one, monitoring implementation plans and sampling, exceedances, third-party lawsuit risks, and towards the end, we will have time for Q&A. So, what is the purpose of an industrial general permit? This general permit authorizes dischargers of industrial stormwater to waters of the United States so long as those discharges comply with all requirements, provisions, limitations, prohibitions in this general permit. In other words, the industrial general permit aims to reduce the concentration of pollutants mobilized by stormwater and transported into bodies of water. The general goal of this regulation is not to penalize facilities whose samples go over the monitoring limits, but to create consistent practice of monitoring and feedback about what works and what doesn't at a given facility, such that when exceedances do happen, action is taken to improve the situation and bring them back within acceptable limits. So who must apply to or for IGP coverage? Facilities directly related to manufacturing, processing, or raw material storage that have stormwater commingle with industrial activity must apply for IGP coverage. The IGP regulates discharges associated with 9 federally defined categories of industrial activity, such as manufacturing, which includes wineries, hazardous waste facilities, landfills, recycling, and others. Not all SIC codes do require coverage, and the ones that do are shown in attachment A of the permit document. Great. So in each IGP application, different roles need to be established, and some of those roles are displayed on the screen here. And first off, the discharger is the facility itself. Then we have the legally responsible person, which can be an owner or corporate officer. In a sole proprietorship, the LRP needs to be the owner. And in a corporation, it needs to be someone who can make legally binding agreements and commitments for the company. For a corporate officer, they will accept a president, secretary, vice president, a treasurer, or someone in charge of principal business function. The LRP is required to establish a login to the SMARTS website, execute legal agreement with the water board at the initial submittal of the stormwater plan, and may assign a duly authorized representative, which we will touch on, or a data submitter to the facility on smarts. Next, we have the duly authorized representative, which could be a facility manager or environmental officer. And this is someone who has a responsibility for the overall operation of the facility. The DAR, like the LRP, can certify and submit documents to the SMARTS website. Next, we have the data submitter, who is a consultant and or facility personnel who can upload samples. A data submitter is someone like Summit who you can contact to have submit data for you in the SMARTS website. But keep in mind that the data that is uploaded by a data submitter will need to be approved and certified by either the LRP or the duly authorized representative before it is reviewed by the water board. Review usually takes between 1 and 2 weeks after certification. And we also want to note that this permit is set up for facilities to be able to develop and submit plans on their own. Some facilities elect to have us involved right from the start, setting up the plans and the site map for them. Alternatively, your team can prepare and submit the initial documents. The only occasion that requires getting professional assistance is if you have an exceedance, after which there are tasks that you need to have a certified QISP or qualified industrial SWIP practitioner to conduct. Okay. So what are the paths to regulatory coverage? There are a few types of coverage that a facility can apply to. The first and most common is standard enrollment. This means that you have some areas where there is potential for stormwater to become commingled with process waste or other industrial materials. Next, we have a non-exposure certification or an NEC, where industrial materials are not exposed to stormwater. In this case, all industrial materials and activities could be protected by stormwater resistant shelters to prevent all exposure to rain, snow, snowmelt, and or runoff. And a storm resistant shelter is, it could be a roofed or walled building, or a structure that is only top covered by and supported by permanent supports that are not necessarily covered on all sides. And this is all provided that the material within these storm resistant shelters are not subjected to wind dispersion. And what is the benefit for non-exposure certification? Well, an NEC will avoid all monitoring and the need for the development of a SWIP. Next, we have a notice of non-applicability or a NONA. And this is a facility where no water leaves the site. And this is typically limited to a site with a designed feature to catch all runoff and detain it. For example, we have seen wineries that have NONA coverage that have all drains in their facility go to their ponds. And the ponds are sized so that they can hold enough capacity to capture whatever storm event occurs. Lastly, we have compliance groups, and a compliance group can be established for an owner who has multiple facilities and wants to reduce reporting and manage their stormwater permit compliance altogether. More commonly, we see facilities grouped together between owners who all share the benefit of reduced reporting frequency. Dischargers in the same industry can form compliance groups. This means dischargers in the same standard industrial classification or SIC codes. And there is a need to appoint a compliance group leader, and that is a person that is a QISP trainer of record. Julian of our office, who couldn't be here today, holds this title. And you may be asking yourself, what is the benefit of a compliance group? Well, that would be the reduced frequency of sampling, and sampling can be reduced from 4 times a year to 2 times a year when under compliance group coverage. So what's the process to get enrolled? Well, for standard enrollment, it would be submitting initial documents such as the notice of intent, the signed certification statement, a site map, a SWIP, and a fee. And once coverage is obtained, the facility will be required to annually submit stormwater sampling, annual compliance evaluations, annual reports, and any updates to a SWIP and site map, updates to personnel, and an annual fee. For NEC coverage, the initial documents that need to be submitted are an NEC form, an NEC checklist, which consists of 11 questions, a site map, and a fee. And once coverage is obtained, then an annual recertification and an annual fee will need to be submitted. And not included here is the NONA, but in order to obtain certification with the NONA, a technical report and calculation signed by a California licensed engineer showing the facility is engineered and constructed to contain the maximum historic precipitation event or series of events. I do want to point out, though, as we continue, that the majority of the remaining information that we will go into refers to standard enrollment processes. So how does this apply to wineries? Well, as previously mentioned, industrial activities such as the typical outdoor industrial activities seen on the screen can be exposed to stormwater and cause contamination. Industrial activities can create opportunities for commingling of industrial pollutants and stormwater, and commingling of runoff can come from various places, including diversion valves, from outletting to a crush pad, or even run on from a public road commingling with a crush pad. While the state and the industrial general permit don't preclude a winery from having winery functions outdoors or uncovered, Napa County specifically is working through their permitting opportunities to minimize outdoor winemaking by requiring work areas to be covered whenever they can. We recommend that wineries plan for water compliance when making improvements to their facilities. And this could be maximizing coverage of industrial activities, plan site grading to eliminate run-on and isolate industrial activity from area flows, and install easy to sample monitoring locations. Having talked about the activities that can cause opportunities for contamination, what are some of the common culprits? Well, that would be grape waste, pomace, grape juice, wine, caustics, sodium percarbonate, or glycol, which are common materials found in winery facilities. Whenever possible, it is best to keep these materials and handle them indoors to reduce contamination. Now I will pass this on to Jasper, who will talk to you about the components of a SWIP.
Good afternoon, you guys. Thanks for joining us. All right, the first item I'd like to cover is SWIP components, dive a little bit into that. So the key pieces or the required items on your stormwater pollution prevention plan is a facility name and contact information, significant industrial materials, a description and assessment of the pollution sources, and the minimum advanced BMPs that are identified for the site, monitoring and implementation plan, which is a description of how you're going to react for or address sampling and in the event of exceedance. And then stormwater pollution prevention plan effective dates, when it starts, and then finally the site map, which is an important aspect of it. So yeah, and one thing I did want to point out before I advance from that slide is that this SWIP should be accessible on site. It's a living document and it contains all of your reporting information. You do want to have that somewhere accessible in addition to what gets uploaded to the SMARTS website. So the SWIP process, this is something that this is outlined as we take it as if we when we approach a site, but also if a facility is preparing their own SWIP. Basically, first off is a site assessment. So review the site to identify the potential contaminants and the working activities that could result in contamination. The next is to gather information about the facility. This includes the personnel who are going to be involved in the stormwater activities, and then the materials that are stored on site, where those are located, how much in quantity, how frequently they're utilized. And then the next, we draft a report and prepare a site map. Those two tend to go hand in hand. And then we review that with the stakeholders, making sure that everybody's reviewed it and is bought off on the approach and the recommendations. Then you gather the signatures from the legally responsible person and the duly authorized representative, who both need to sign the document, and it gets uploaded to SMARTS. And once it's uploaded to SMARTS, again, as Jesus mentioned, it needs to be submitted or certified by the LRP, where they go about kind of executing the agreement with the water board. And then finally, after about a week to 2 weeks of water board review time, it's accepted by the water board. So I'm going to go through a few kind of important components of the SWIP. And the first one is the minimum best management practices. So the areas that are covered in the minimum best management practices are good housekeeping, preventative maintenance, spill and leak prevention and response, material handling, erosion and sediment control, employee training, and then quality assurance and record keeping. And so a few examples: good housekeeping includes sweeping and cleaning up of dust and debris, keeping stormwater separate from industrial materials. Preventative maintenance would include replacing damaged containers or tanks, and looking for leaky equipment on a regular basis. Spill and leak prevention would be storage of materials in a way that if it does spill, it won't contaminate or cause a contamination. And then material handling. So you want to get any solid waste to receptacles such as trash bins and make sure that those are covered and well protected from storm events. Erosion and sediment controls would involve make sure that runoff is directed away from both your work areas and any erodible materials on site, and then that any erodible materials, roads, that type of things, are stabilized and prevent erosion. So there are also advanced best management practices, and these are they're included on a case-by-case basis. The regulation states that dischargers shall, to the extent feasible, implement and maintain any advanced BMPs necessary to reduce or prevent discharges of pollutants in its stormwater discharge in a manner that reflects best industry practices, considering technological availability and economic practicability and achievability. So like I said, these are included on a case-by-case basis, and they're not always identified in the kind of on the outset of authoring a SWIP, but they are certainly additional items that can be implemented if there are exceedances or need to be or things need to be addressed. As an example, one thing that people worry about or kind of comes to mind is like the catastrophic loss of a full tank of wine, and so that would fall into the advanced containment BMP. But it's rarely practical to provide full containment for loss of a tank. So then you would think of, well, what what would be the path of drainage that would and that would you can help identify the risks downstream and how your team would respond. So just as an example of a site plan, and go through a couple of items to in terms of what's required. These can come in a variety of levels of detail. There's some key pieces that are included, but we can kind of draw the picture as clearly as is available. But minimum requirements are the facility boundary, drainage areas and flow directions, stormwater collection and conveyances, structural control measures, impervious areas, locations of materials, and areas of industrial activities. So it kind of, in addition to that, we find that it's really helpful to identify or distinguish between the drainage of stormwater versus drainage of processed waste on wineries. So you clearly see that delineated between the magenta color of the storm drains and the golden color of the process waste lines in this picture. And then we identify industrial area material storage, limits of canopies, things that are covered, uncovered, and certainly any impervious surfaces that exist on the site. So the next important component of the SWIP is the monitoring and implementation plan. And this talks about who does what, who's going to respond in and do the sampling in the event of a rain event. The rain event tracking is about forecasting or monitoring your forecasts for when rain might occur and being ready to respond with sampling. It's also, this section of the report would also talk about visual observations, the frequency and who will perform that work, and response procedures, and sample collection, and finally training. And one thing to note on training is that mostly training is allowed to be conducted by the facility personnel. It's making sure that everybody involved in responding to a stormwater event and preparing the site for stormwater to prevent contaminated runoff is educated at the beginning of a season. This time of year is a great time to do that training. So the only time that you need to kind of hire outside help is that in the event of an exceedance and a facility or a constituent moves from baseline to a level 1, which is the heightened level of regulatory scrutiny in this regulation, then you would need to hire a qualified industrial stormwater practitioner or a QISP to perform the training as well as do that ERA, or the emergency response action. Okay, so then I want to talk a little bit about the calendar year and kind of how events that come about. So I'm going to cover the idea of the calendar year and distinguish that from the rain year or the water year. So the beginning of the water year is July 1st, and it extends to June 30th. And so the way that the regulation is written, you need 2 samples in the first half of the water year, which typically are going to come about in October, November. So as we're coming up to those time frames, you're going to be thinking about making sure you catch the first 2 opportunities to sample. And then you'll have 2 samples in the second half of the water year, which will probably be the January, February timeframe, maybe extending into March and April, depending on how the rain comes. But you definitely want to get those done before it really dries out. And so making sure that you collect those samples when they occur. Then at the end of the year, after June 30th, is when the water year will close out, and then you have until July 15th to file your annual report. And just as a point of note, compliance groups, participants only need 1 sample in the first half of the year and 1 in the second half of the year. Also, in addition to that, you would be doing monthly site inspections, which get recorded in the SWIP binder. And then there's an annual comprehensive facility compliance evaluation, which is done that informs the annual report, but typically it's good to do that in the spring months, April, May, June, sometime around that period of time in preparation for your annual report. The only regulatory requirement about that is that there's one a year that where you kind of comprehensively review your facility. And it needs to be no more frequent than within 8 months to the next one, and no more distant than 16 months to the next one. So as long as it's happening each year, you're in good shape. All right. To bring up the concept of how do you identify a qualifying storm event, something that would warrant sampling or that you'd be required to sample? The definition is that rain that produces discharge for at least one drainage area that is preceded by 48 hours of no discharge from the site. So kind of as an example, if you had a rainy couple weeks, you could get those two samples out pretty quickly if you had rain and then a period of break of 48 hours where there was no discharge from the site, and then you have another rain event. And so the key piece about kind of understanding this concept is that a qualifying rain event is if it produces runoff. And also kind of the antithesis of that is that if you can't gather a sample, you're not expected to report a sample. And if there is not enough qualifying samples during work hours during a given year, then that's acceptable reason to not have or submit all of your required samples, the 2 in the first half and the 2 in the second half that we talked about. But you do need to have documentation. So as you're going through the year, every rain event that occurs, it's good to keep records of if you did sample, didn't sample, and if not, why. The next, just wanted to run through a couple of scenarios of examples of qualifying storm events and when they occur during a day or a work hour. So scenario 1, we have the light blue here is going to indicate some sprinkling, but it's not quite you're not experiencing runoff from the site yet. So this sprinkling or the light rain occurs before work hours, and then there is runoff. Heavy rain starts to come down, runoff is occurring. That qualified storm event is now active once the runoff occurs from some part of your site. And if that happens before work hours, as in scenario 1, then you would be required to sample once work hours begin for your facility. In scenario 2, let's say that your rain event starts during work hours, runoff is observed, it occurs, so you have a qualifying storm event. Well, then you would want to sample within the next 4 hours. And then the final scenario, number 3, this is when no runoff occurs during work hours, but it might have started to sprinkle after work hours. Runoff is occurring. Your big storm is happening overnight. No sampling is needed from that storm event. And if, for example, if all of yours occurred in the in the weekends and or evenings or after work, and there were no 2 opportunities where runoff occurred from your site during work hours, again, that would be reasonable basis to not have the 2 samples that you're expected to submit. Okay, so some sampling techniques. I just wanted to review these quickly. A lot of them are common sense, but be aware of stirring up sediment when sampling. You want to have a clean sample that represents the runoff from your site. Only analyze for the required constituents. So typically the reports that come back from the labs include, they just itemize all of the tabulated results from your sampling. You wouldn't want to have extraneous or additional samples that you thought you wanted to know what the condition was. If you're not required to report it, you'd want to have it on a separate tag to your laboratory, because you will ultimately submit those lab reports up to the website, and you really only want to publicly display what is required. Then sample only the industrial areas. Again, you only want to capture the areas that are that you're required to sample, and that potential pollutants could be the result of the activities that you're being regulated for. And then finally, calibrate your pH meter before every sampling event. We've seen error or extraneous numbers that are exceedances because of incorrectly calibrated pH meters, and so that's something you want to avoid. Again, pH is the only sampling that is done on site. All the rest is usually sent to a lab because they have the equipment needed for that. Okay. Cover the stormwater concentration limits briefly here. All facilities regulated under the industrial general permit are required to sample these constituents: pH, TSS, or total suspended solids, and oil and grease. There may be other constituents that a facility is required to sample, but these ones apply to everyone, and it doesn't matter if you're producing wine or making tires. Everybody is regulated under the same requirements. So just a couple of items here: the concept of annual NALs versus instantaneous maximum NALs. The annual NALs are averaged over the year, and so they're a little bit more stringent for TSS and oil and grease. So your samples throughout the year, the 4 that you're going to take are, you would need to keep under a 100 milligrams per liter on TSS and 15 on oil and gas. But you can have individual samples that are higher than that. But if you have any that are over 400 in TSS or 25 in oil and gas, or oil and grease, sorry, then those are immediately an exceedance by the state. pH is the same for annual or average, so your groups just get averaged together for that. All right. So every facility starts at baseline, and you start at baseline for each of the constituents that you have to sample for. They're treated separately. So pH separate from total suspended solids. If you have an exceedance, your facility is then elevated to level 1. And at that point, a QISP, qualified SWIP practitioner, needs to be engaged to prepare an ERA, an emergency response action. That's an evaluation and report at the level 1. And so then generally you're in that level 1 for your next water year. And this information kind of comes to the state as you finalize your annual report. And you may get a letter kind of towards the end of the year, December, January, that, yeah, if you haven't engaged your QISP and to do an ERA, you need to, but you may not get that on a timely basis. So be on the lookout for this. If you are successful in that level 1 year and you implement all of the ERA recommendations and you have 4 consecutive samples with no exceedances, then you return to baseline and you kind of operate as normal. If, on the other hand, you have another exceedance in one of the next 4 samples, then you elevate to level 2 level 2 under the regulation. And that requires a QISP to prepare an ERA, an action plan, and a technical report. And that's an elevated effort to identify the contaminants and resolve the issue. So again, at this juncture, you have a fork in the road, or 2 paths forward. If you're implementing all of the BMPs recommended in that ERA, and you have 4 consecutive samples with no exceedance, then you return to baseline. You don't have to pass through level 1. You just go immediately back to baseline. And then if you do continue to have exceedances, then you remain in level 2 and continue to update your technical report. It gets updated at least on an annual basis with new analysis of what the problem is and evidence that you've continued to improve the situation and tried to resolve the contaminants. All right. So another topic which has become a hot one is the third-party lawsuit risks. And so some real basic or critical items to be watchful of that really open yourself up to those risks are later missed reporting, later missed certification, exceedances with no ERA follow-up, and staining or stockpiling materials visible in satellite photos. So we've seen these third-party activist groups target facilities for all of these items. And we've seen a rapid increase in the frequency of wineries specifically being targeted by these environmental activists, advocate groups. We've heard them referred to as a shakedown. A facility may receive a letter accusing them of a violation, and sometimes it includes a real threatening dollar value it could be based on all of the potential violations that a water board might apply, and those can add up pretty quickly, especially for folks who are have not been enrolled since 2015. A daily, theoretical fine would, become an astronomical number. That doesn't hold kind of reality about what someone would be asked to pay, but it's a very threatening. It gets your attention when a letter like that comes across. Ultimately, these groups settle for a much smaller dollar value typically. But one thing I want everybody to be aware of is that the state SMART website just provides this really easily searchable source for these third-party activist groups or advocate groups to be to just sit in their offices and file through the looking for who might have missed a reporting occasion. So again, being tight with the with the timelines and the having the information uploaded to SMARTS is really important because it protects you a lot. Originally, we saw that these third-party groups were only finding facilities that had enrolled but had missed an ad hoc report or an annual report, and so there was some perception, and that amongst facilities that, well, you might be safer to not even file, right? Because the water board is less likely to kind of seek you out. But recently, we've seen that the third-party groups have become more sophisticated and are targeting facilities that never enrolled in the first place, which indicates that they're cross-referencing the SMARTS database with some other list of winery filing data. So they can kind of have a list of what they know, facilities that exist, and start to go pick off folks who may not have been aware that they needed to file under this regulation. They also look for what an exceedant, for when an exceedance has been reported, but no ERA has been prepared. So again, I mentioned that as a potential risk. And then since most anyone who kind of engages with these groups settles, and these folks typically agree to an NDA, there's no sharing of knowledge between facilities. So that's a real loss, I think, for the industry, and no organized opposition to them for this kind of one at a time targeting of facilities. In general, we see that they don't appear to be concerned with the actual evidence of contamination of stormwater. They're mostly focused on the procedural reporting requirements. And so it appears that if you meet the reporting requirements, you can generally steer clear of these folks, whether you have an exceedance here or there or not, as long as you're dealing with that in the prescribed manner. And their foot in the door is really the missed report, and then they negotiate with you to update a SWIP or sampling practices under the auspices of improving water quality. And then they settle and negotiate a dollar value. One thing I will note is that copper and zinc are items that constituents that they often ask for to be included in sampling, and they argue that brake pads and fuel from vehicles can contribute to these constituents in stormwater. So, yeah, so it's a little bit of a downer, but I did want to mention that, our office and a number of legal firms around the area are developing quite a bit of experience responding to the alleged violations. And so definitely feel free to reach out if you're approached by that. So next, we wanted to open it up to questions, and Jesus, I'll turn it back over to you.
Do industrial activities extend to docks for warehouses where cased goods are delivered and picked up?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that being part of the facility, the docks, loading docks would be part of should be covered under the industrial stormwater plan.
Great. Another question we received is, What is the burden of proof for when a QSE begins, but no one is on site to know the timing?
Yeah, so if a qualifying storm event is occurs, but nobody's on site to identify it. Right, so if it doesn't occur during working hours, you wouldn't need to sample it, but having some awareness that it could be a qualifying storm event or that rain did occur, that would be important to document. You know, as you get to the end of the water year in June, often, you know, without some kind of extemporaneous records, you will kind of forget that, you know, when those rain events occurred. And so really the annual report, there's an opportunity to just narrate or describe, you know, kind of the reasons for why sampling did not occur. But yeah, you're only required to sample when runoff or a qualifying storm event occurs during working hours.
Is there proof that needs to be submitted along with this if proving that the qualifying storm event happened outside of work hours?
Right. So there is, again, it's a narrative information that gets updated to the SMARTS website. But you would want to have that as recourse or backup if you're ever questioned by the water board, because you know, as you describe it out to the water board through SMARTS, you know, we haven't seen this occur, but if their records or if they dove into it and saw that rain events that they could look at in terms of the historical record of rain events didn't match up with your accounting of when they occurred and what the conditions were that resulted in you not needing to sample, that could be a point of issue that they would follow up with you on. But again, we have not seen them pursue that.
And Jasper, we actually got a follow-up for that original question. Can we specify only production work hours versus when hospitality folks are on site or an event is taking place?
Yeah, this would be related to the industrial activity. I think it'd be very appropriate to state in your SWIP that the work hours are related to the production activities.
Are cities and counties testing their storm drains? If not, why are they not being included in this process?
Yeah, great question. So there is a separate regulatory requirement for municipal storm drain systems. And in Napa County, for example, it covers the entire county, even though there aren't structured drainage systems. They are part of what's called the MS4 or municipal stormwater systems. There's separate regulation that covers those dischargers, and so yes, that's one reason that Napa County is very much focused on the requirements of stormwater cleanliness, is that they are regulated and highly scrutinized by the state for the condition of their stormwater system through this MS4 permit. And so they are testing regularly at various places and reporting that. But it's interesting. It's kind of behind a wall. It's not related to the industrial stormwater world. It's kind of through a different umbrella regulation.
And a winery needs to submit their stormwater permits if they have applied for a winery use permit in Napa County in 2008, but have not yet constructed the winery. And it seems like this facility is receiving letters from the environmental groups that they are not in compliance.
The application needs to be in time for actual work activity, actual production. I've heard about similar situations that you've talked about where there may be an application in, but they have not yet started operating, that may have received letters. And my understanding is that the third-party watchdog groups will back off pretty quickly when they understand that there's no facility to regulate. But yeah, it can be alarming nonetheless to get the letter. And yeah, per the regulation, there's no need to enroll until you actually are operating a facility.
Do I need to submit monthly inspections to the SMARTS website?
You do not. The monthly inspections is important to conduct, and it is required by the regulation. It would theoretically need to be stored with your on-site stormwater pollution prevention plan, if it's in a binder or if it's something you store digitally, so that if a regulator were ever to come to your site to ask for that, they would be available. But it does not need to be uploaded to the SMARTS system. It is kind of background record information as you go to do your annual report.
What is the difference between an ad hoc report and an annual report?
Yeah, great question. The ad hoc report is a report of the sampling data from an individual sample, and the annual report is kind of sums up all of the information at the end of the year and includes answers to questions related to your comprehensive annual review of your site.
How much time do I have to submit sampling results after a qualifying storm event?
Jesus, do you have that one?
Sure. All sampling results need to be submitted within 30 days of a qualifying storm event. Do we need to submit a new ISWIP if there are changes to our site map? In this case, the facility is planning to expand, so they will be having a new site plan.
Yeah, I think the question was about updating. Does the SWIP need to be updated if aspects of the site plan are changing? Yeah, and you can individually upload a revised site plan, but based on the nature of what you described of the kind of improvements or addition to the site plan, it would also include changes to potentially sampling locations and new areas of impervious surface and kind of the way that the drainage system functions. So yeah, those would require or warrant an update to the SWIP.
That's right. And adding to that a little bit, if there's also industrial activity that is not covered, we may also want to update the SWIP and describe that in your SWIP now.
Okay, everyone, just want to thank you again for joining us, spending your lunch hour with us. If you have any specific questions that you didn't get answered here, or again, a very specific site-specific question, feel free to reach out to us at any time. Here is Jasper and Jesus's contact information, so feel free to email them. I've also included Julian Kane, who is an ISWIP master in our office as well. He wasn't able to join us today. And again, I will be sending around the recording of this webinar as well as the slides. So if there were graphs or maps that you'd like to reference further, I'll have that information to you as soon as possible. Thank you all again. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.